Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
I always thought I had a decent grasp on the civil rights movement, but getting ready for this deep dive into the period between 1900 and 1961 was like opening up a whole new chapter.
Yeah.
A chapter I never even knew was there. We're going to uncover these intricate legal battles and all the political maneuvering that set the stage for like the movement's later triumphs, like think Hidden Figures and Unsung Heroes, but using the courts as their battleground. And our source for this journey back in time, it's episode 106 of the Mr. Hutchings History podcast. It's called The Struggle for Equality, Civil Rights and Government Intervention, 1900-1961. So get ready. It's about to get fascinating.
What I find so captivating about this era is how it really shows us the long and winding road to equality. I mean, we often focus on those landmark moments of the 60s, but those victories, they were built on decades of struggle, often against like seemingly impossible odds.
Yeah, it's like a mystery almost, right? I mean, if the goal was equality, why did it all move so slowly? Especially when, we see some early legal wins for civil rights.
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. Take, for example, the Guinn v. United States case. This was back in 1915. Now, you may not know about this one, but it was a major crack in the wall of voter suppression. The Supreme Court struck down what was called the grandfather clause, a sneaky tactic used in southern states to keep black people from voting. These clauses said you could only vote if your grandfather had been allowed to vote. So, this basically shut out most black citizens. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they saw this as a really big step toward equal voting rights.
Okay, yeah, that is some clever lawyering. But, so if the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, why didn't things just change right away?
Yes, the million-dollar question. The Supreme Court, they could make these rulings, but actually enforcing them, that was a totally different thing. The South especially, I mean, they were really resistant to change, and they had some friends in high places, powerful allies in Congress.
You're talking about those Southern Democrats, right?
Yeah.
The ones who had, like, so much power, especially in those key committees.
That's right. They were masters at blocking things, using their positions to stop any laws that threatened, the way things were. Segregation, think about it, anti-lynching laws, getting rid of poll taxes, right? All these measures to protect black citizens, they were all systematically shut down.
So even when people wanted change, and clearly the NAACP and many others did, there wasn't always a way to make it happen because of, the way the political system worked.
It was a constant uphill battle. Even presidents like FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he had to be super careful. He needed the support of those Southern Democrats for his New Deal. So he couldn't, make them mad by pushing too hard on civil rights.
Think of it as a game of chess. Every move could have big consequences.
Right. It means that even the president couldn't just, end segregation just like that. It was really, really deeply rooted in the system. And that leads us to this kind of paradox about the government's role. On one hand, we see these presidents taking steps to move civil rights forward, but then on the other hand, we see the government, often Congress, actually holding progress back.
Hold on. I need an example because that sounds like super contradictory.
Okay, sure. Let's look at Truman's Fair Deal. You probably know about the New Deal, but Truman, he wanted to go even further with his own social reforms, and part of his Fair Deal was a strong push for, civil rights protection. He even suggested a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission to stop discrimination in hiring. Can you guess what happened?
I have a feeling I know where this is going.
Yeah, you got it. Southern Democrats in Congress, they blocked it every step of the way. They saw any interference from the federal government in racial matters as a direct attack on their way of life. And they used their power to make sure that most of the civil rights stuff in the Fair Deal never even got off the ground.
So even when you had a president like Truman, who, seemed like he really wanted to push for civil rights, the system itself was working against him.
It was a constant back and forth, and the forces against change, they had a lot of control. Truman did manage to desegregate the military in 1948. He used an executive order. It was a huge move. It showed his commitment to racial equality, at least within the armed forces. But when it came to broader action, legislation and stuff, he faced massive pushback.
So we have these early legal wins, like the one with the grandfather clause, which are important, but they don't lead to big changes right away. Then we have a president who tries for bigger reforms, but he's stopped by the political system. It feels like taking one step forward and then two steps back.
And that's exactly what makes this period so interesting. It wasn't just a simple story of, good guys versus bad guys. It was this complicated mix of legal stuff, political stuff, and deep-seated societal prejudices. All of that coming together to shape how quickly progress could be made.
And I guess that sets the stage for, Brown v. Board of Education. That was in 1954. Talk about a turning point. I mean, after decades of fighting, the Supreme Court finally says that segregated schools are not equal. That had to have been a huge win, right?
Brown v. Board, it was a massive legal victory. It was the result of years of strategic litigation by the NAACP. They were very smart about it. They chipped away at that separate but equal doctrine that came from Plessy v. Ferguson back in 1896. Their argument was that separate facilities were inherently unequal and violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law.
Okay, so they finally overturned Plessy. That's like a legal earthquake. But so did this ruling actually lead to integrated schools all over the country?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. That's where the story takes a dramatic turn. See, the South, in many ways, just flat out refused to accept the Brown ruling.
Wait, are you serious? They just ignored the Supreme Court?
It wasn't quite that simple, but the resistance, it was fierce. What happened is what historians call massive resistance. Some states actually chose to shut down public schools rather than integrate them. Think about that. Closing the doors to education completely, rather than letting black and white children learn together.
That's just crazy. So what did the government do about this? I mean, they were basically defying the law.
It was a really important moment. It was a test of the government's commitment to actually enforcing the law. And, well, as you might imagine,
Right.
things didn't go smoothly. Not at all. One of the most striking examples of this resistance played out in Little Rock, Arkansas. This was in 1957. 9 black students, they were known as the Little Rock Nine. They tried to enroll at Central High School. It was a previously all-white school. And that we were met with a wall of hostility, threats, violence, And the governor, Orville Faubus, he actually sent in the National Guard to stop them from going into the school.
Wait a minute. The National Guard to keep kids out of school. That's just, I can't even wrap my head around that.
Yeah, it was a real stark image. It showed just how far these segregationists would go to keep things the way they were. And it put Eisenhower in a really tough spot.
Eisenhower, right?
Yeah, President Eisenhower. At first, he didn't want to get involved, but then, you had those images of those brave students facing down this angry mob. It was all over the news. It forced his hand.
So Eisenhower, he finally did something.
He did, but it took a while and a lot of pressure. What he ended up doing was he federalized the Arkansas National Guard, took control away from Faubus, and then he sent in units of the 101st Airborne Division, actual combat troops, to escort the Little Rock Nine into Central High.
Wow. Sending in the Army to integrate a high school. That's powerful. But it shows just how deep segregation ran. So where does all this leave us in terms of how historians look at this era? You said earlier there were different schools of thought.
Right, yeah. Historians, they have different ideas about, what really drove change during this time. Some historians are called legalists. They see those legal battles, those big court decisions, Brown v. Board, as the main things pushing progress forward. They think that even though these rulings, sometimes took a while to have an effect, they ultimately set the stage for later victories, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
So for them, it's all about the courts,
Yes.
The lawyers, the legal strategy.
Yeah, pretty much. They argue that the NAACP's approach, which was very careful and slow and step-by-step. It was crucial in breaking down segregation. But then you have the revisionist historians. They challenge that view. They say, okay, legal victories, those were important. But it was really the pressure from the people, from those grassroots movements, the Montgomery bus boycott, that really forced the government to act and sped things up.
So for them, it's more about people power, like collective action.
Exactly. They highlight the incredible bravery of everyday people who, through boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides, all those forms of nonviolent resistance, they put themselves on the line to challenge segregation. The Montgomery bus boycott, for example, that started when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. It went on for over a year. It completely crippled the city's bus system, and it showed just how powerful collective action could be.
It's amazing to think about the impact regular people had. It wasn't just about lawyers in courtrooms. It was about ordinary people saying enough is enough.
Absolutely. And then you have the progressive historians. They take a more critical view of the government's role. Their argument is that, sure, some people in the government supported civil rights, but the system itself, it was often a roadblock to progress. Think back to those Southern Democrats we talked about earlier. They weren't just a few bad guys. They represented a whole power structure that worked to keep segregation in place.
So it wasn't just about individual prejudice. It was about how the government, especially Congress, was structured and how that made it hard to make real change.
Right. And this brings us to another group, the institutionalists. They really dig into the nuts and bolts of how the government works. They focus on how the rules and procedures in Congress, things like the filibuster in the Senate, and how committees were set up. Those things gave Southern segregationists a ton of power to block civil rights laws.
Wow. It's like peeling back layers of an onion. We started with these legal victories, then we see the power of these grassroots movements, and now we're seeing how the government itself was creating obstacles. It's way more complicated than I thought.
And that's what's so great about really digging into history. It's rarely a simple story. It's about understanding how different forces interact, the push and pull between progress and resistance, and how individuals and institutions shape what happens.
Okay, so we've looked at these different historical perspectives, but what about the bigger picture? If we try to put all this information together, this fight for civil rights between 1900 and 1961, what are the main things we should take away from this?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that it was a long and difficult struggle with victories and then setbacks and delays. Progress was rarely a straight line.
It's like we saw with the Brown v. Board ruling, right? It was a huge win legally.
Yeah.
But it didn't mean schools were integrated right away. It actually caused a ton of resistance. And that just shows how limited court decisions can be, especially when it comes to changing deeply held beliefs.
You got it. And it emphasizes how important it is to understand the government's role. It was complex and often contradictory. Sometimes the government acted as a champion for civil rights, like with Truman and the military. But other times, it was a bottleneck, with Southern Democrats in Congress stopping or weakening civil rights laws.
So it was a constant battle, a tug of war between those pushing for change and those trying to keep things the same.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really important to remember that the legal strategy the NAACP used, it was essential, but it wasn't enough on its own. To get real lasting change, it took more than that. It took a combination of legal action, grassroots activism, and eventually stronger action from the federal government.
This has been really eye-opening. I feel like I understand the fight for civil rights so much better now, and how progress can be, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
And it reminds us that the fight for equality isn't over. It's something that continues. And each generation, they have their own challenges and their own chances to push for justice. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. Learning about all those battles, the politics, the resistance, and the courage of the people fighting for equality, it's a reminder of how hard it was to win these rights.
Yeah, it shows that progress, it rarely follows a straight line. It often means challenging the way things are, pushing back against those in power, and sometimes even putting yourself at risk to achieve, a more just and fair society.
Right. It's been a real eye-opener for me. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with something to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, imagine you were living back then, knowing what we know now. How would you have fought for civil rights? Would you have focused on, legal stuff, grassroots activism, or maybe something else entirely?
That's a really great question, and it highlights why understanding history is so important. By immersing ourselves in the struggles and the successes of those who came before us, we gain these insights into how social change happens and the different paths that can lead to progress.
It's like we've been talking about this whole time. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's rarely the result of just one thing. It takes time, dedication, strategic planning, and often a combination of approaches to break down these systems of inequality that are so deeply rooted.
Yeah. And we have to remember that the fight for civil rights, it never really ends. It's an ongoing process, a constant effort to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity and equal protection under the law. It becomes a reality for everyone. Each generation, they inherit the legacy of those who fought for justice before them, and they have a responsibility to carry that torch forward.
Yeah. This deep dive has been a powerful reminder. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And those giants, they faced huge challenges, setbacks, resistance, but they kept going. And their efforts, they paved the way for the progress we see today.
Yeah. Their stories, they inspire us. They inspire us to keep fighting for equality, to challenge injustice wherever we see it, and to work hard to create a more just and fair world for everyone.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day, think about the things we've learned in this deep dive. Think about the different ways to create social change, the complexities of the fight for civil rights, and how you can contribute to building a better future. After all, the fight for equality, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, and it takes all of us working together.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.